Now let's take a look at the front end side of this. So if you remember, we had a table showing our items that have been listed. We had one form for creating new items, and we had another form for logging in users. So I'm not going to cover the HTML too much. It's pretty simple. We just have an empty table with some headers, name, price, and description. Here's our form, and then for creating new items, and then here's our login form. So to start off, we and I've got a little skeleton here of what we're going to be doing. So when a user first comes to this page, a deepstream client will be created, and it'll be logged in with an empty object, and the get items function will be called. What this get items function is going to do is query for the list that we created on our back end, the list of items, and then go in to call this RenderItem function, which we'll get to in a second. So the first step is to get a reference to our list that we created just a minute ago, and again we'll use this when ready helper function. So we want to do a couple of things in here. First of which is listen to the on entry added event. Whenever this happens, we'll want to call this RenderItem function. And also, we just want to take note of this initial variable we have. So initial will only be true if it's the first time a client has navigated to this page. And that means we'll just fetch the data for the first time, and any subsequent times we log in, we're not going to refetch data and populate the table with stale data. So we say if it's the initial load, we go list.get entries .for each, and we just pass that RenderItem function in. Quick look at the RenderItem function. It's receiving a record name, and then getting the record, and then it's just inserting the record into the table. The syntax for accessing properties is just record.get, and then you pass the property name in. So this is how we populate the table. Now that we've loaded the items for the first time, we want to look at listing an item. If you'll remember the form we had earlier for listing items, we have a name, a price, and a description, and description boxes. So what we want to do is get a reference to these. And earlier we registered an RPC called create item. So we're just going to be calling that with the client here. So syntax for that is rpc.make list item, and the data we're going to pass in here is just going to be the name, the price, and the description. We get a callback from this as well, and we want to say if there was an error, we'll just send an alert saying error listing item. Now we also said that users should not be able to list items if they're not logged in. So we're not going to cover it in this tutorial, but using Valve, the permissioning language in deepstreamHub, you can just create rules that allow only authenticated users the ability to call these RPCs. If you're not logged in, obviously our users are going to need to log in. And the way we do that is a bit tricky. So obviously our client that we have initially is logged in with an empty object, so we need to create a new client and log them in with the the user's details, and then close the old one. So we're going to make a new variable here called authenticated client, and we're just going to say deepstream, and that's going to be our app URL, and we have the email and password that the users entered into those text boxes. Here we want to say authenticated client.login, and we're just going to pass in the email and password there, and we're going to get a callback with success and data. So if this login is successful, it means that this user already has an account in deepstreamHub. So we can say if success, we close the old client, the unauthenticated one. Client becomes our new authenticated client, and we can call that getItems function, which, if you remember, basically just subscribes to new entries in the list of items. We're not passing the initial variable, which means we're not going to refetch the old data, so the state of our table is going to stay correct. If success is not true, there's a couple of things that could have happened. We could have the user has entered their password wrong. So in this case, we'd say if data and data.reason is equal to invalid credentials used to log in, then we know that the users just entered their details wrong, and we can alert them with that. In the other case, we're going to need to create that user. So if you remember, we had the button we called, it was login or sign up. So if the user doesn't exist, we're just going to sign them up. We've already created the RPC called create user. So what we need to do is just call that rpc.make create user. We're going to pass the email and password in, and again we get a callback here. So if there were any errors, we're just going to say we'll just alert the user to that and tell them to try again. So error creating user, please try again. Otherwise, the user was created successfully, and now we can log them in. So what we'll do is we'll just exactly like the code above, we say we'll close the unauthenticated one, client is now equal to our authenticated client, then we can say client.login with these new details, and finally again we can call the getItems function, which will just subscribe to new entries in the items list and update the table accordingly. So just to take a step back and look at what we've done here. We've fused the usage of records and RPCs so that only authenticated users can list items. The back-end process we used that registered those RPCs is the one actually editing and modifying that list. So quickly we can take a look at some of the Valve permission rules that might be used here. So in my deepstreamHub organization, we come to deepstreamHub and have a quick look at what the permissions might look like for this. So I haven't bothered to implement any of the record permissions, but it would be simple. All you do is say that the only client who can modify the list of items would be the backend provider process, and obviously all clients can subscribe to and read from that list. Jumping down to RPCs, and what we want to say is that we only want to be able to create a user or request to create a user if the user ID of that client is open. So whenever you log in without credentials, the user ID of that user is going to be open or anonymous. And we also want to say that you can only request the list item RPC if your user ID is not open, or meaning you've actually been authenticated. In just a few lines of code, we've managed to create a real-time storefront kind of thing with some good tips for authentication. See you next time.